Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar, which is the fifth in a series of webinars exploring the harms resulting from the Justice Department's China Initiative. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, and I welcome you on behalf of the co-sponsoring organizations, the APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, Asian Pacific Islander Public Affairs, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Today, we're focusing on the mistrial of University of Tennessee Professor Anming Hu, who was investigated and prosecuted under the China Initiative, and the potential impact this case will have on future prosecutions. Some of you have already submitted questions when you registered for this event. If you have other questions during the webinar, you may submit them through the Q&A feature, and we'll try to incorporate as many of them as we can into the discussion. Please keep in mind that information submitted through the Q&A function is recorded for future viewing. So please limit any personal information that you don't want exposed to the public, because that will become public. The FBI opened an investigation of Professor Hu in 2018, alleging he was a spy for the Chinese government who had ties to the Chinese military. Despite 2 years of investigation, the FBI failed to find any evidence of economic espionage or ties to the Chinese military. But federal prosecutors charged Professor Hu nonetheless, alleging he committed fraud against the US government by improperly omitting a part-time job at a Beijing university on a conflict of interest statement attached to a grant application the university submitted to NASA. Last week, on June 16, 2021, the trial judge declared a mistrial in the case after the jury deadlocked and failed to reach a verdict. This is a telling outcome for the first case against a university professor tried under the China Initiative. The trial revealed deep flaws in the FBI's investigation, of the sort that many of us have been warning about during this webinar series, which reflect the problems with this type of racial and national origin profiling that's inherent to a program called the China Initiative. Today, we have an excellent panel of experts to discuss the case and what it means for our broader advocacy effort to protect Asian and Asian American scientists, particularly Chinese Americans and technologists, from improper government scrutiny. First, I'd like to make it clear that Professor Hu and his wife, Ivy Yang, are with us tonight. And like all good clients, they are going to let their defense attorney, Phil Lomonaco, speak for them. And that should be a lesson for all of us. Always let your attorney speak for you, particularly when the FBI is calling or there's a chance of criminal investigation. Phil successfully shepherded the case through trial and will speak on their behalf and update us on the status of the case. We also have Seton Hall University Law Professor Margaret Lewis, who's the author of Criminalizing China, published in the Northwestern University Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, to help us understand the legal and policy issues that are involved. And Dr. Guiyou Huang, president of Western Illinois University, who will talk about how academic leaders can better protect their students, faculty, and researchers from unwarranted investigations and prosecutions under the China Initiative or any other kind of government scrutiny. But before we begin the panel discussion, I have the great pleasure of introducing two keynote speakers, US Congressman Ted Lieu and Maryland State Senator Susan Lee. I'm not sure if Congressman Lieu is here yet. He doesn't appear so. So let's start with Senator Lee. Senator Susan Lee is a friend of this webinar series. She's been working with us closely and with the APA Justice Task Force to bring attention to our concerns about the China Initiative. And I thank you very much for being here with us, Senator Lee, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike German, and thank you for your exemplary leadership and work on this issue too. It's a real privilege and honor to be here today, but I'd also like to thank Dr. Jeremy Wu, Dr. Stephen Pei, Vincent Wang, and APA Justice and their wonderful team, and all the wonderful sponsoring organizations and leaders who are here today. Congressman Ted Lieu, of course, and hopefully we'll hear from him very soon, and all the esteemed panelists that you will hear from today, which I am very honored to be here to join them also. in this important forum. I just wanted to update you on the progress made in our efforts to have a congressional oversight over what I call outrageous racial profiling of our American scientists of Chinese or Asian descent. I'd like to especially thank and commend Congressman Lieu for speaking today and for being such a sterling champion of our AAPI and all different communities, and for his outstanding leadership and efforts in seeking justice and in calling on the Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz to open a formal review of Professor Hu's case. We in the community are just very deeply disturbed by the considerable and unconscionable damage the China Initiative has inflicted on our AAPI community, and also America's ability to advance science and medical breakthroughs, especially as the world battles this pandemic. But we strongly support efforts, and I just want to say this, to safeguard Americans' interests and prosecute those who are wrongdoers. It's a very grave injustice to target, stereotype, or place suspicion on an entire ethnic group, so reminiscent of a bygone Joe McCarthy era. The enormous devastation to the reputations, careers, and families of those innocent scientists caused by this China initiative merely highlights and necessitates why it is so critical we have congressional oversight to ensure transparency, accountability, because as of today, Congress is only focused on the espionage threat, but not the egregious civil rights violation and how this has impeded America's ability to be that global leader in science. International research and collaboration and protocols that for decades have been encouraged by NIH and other entities are now being arbitrarily criminalized, putting a very chilling effect on our scientists around the country who are very much working hard to advance groundbreaking treatments that will save lives. They are part of the solution to the United States global challenges and not the threat. I just wanted to update you on February the 1st, as you remember, 2021, I and Terry Lerman provided my former Maryland State Senate colleague and current now U.S. Congressman Jamie Raskin a letter requesting a congressional hearing that would shine light on the civil rights violations and the unfair profiling of our scientists. That was signed by prominent scientists, by AAPI and civil rights leaders and organizations, including individuals like former Washington State Governor, U.S. Secretary of Commerce and U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke, former U.S. Secretary of Energy and Nobel laureate, Dr. Stephen Chu, former University of Maryland President Dr. Wallace Lowe, and Dr. Robert Gallo, who many of you know in the science field, and many others. And earlier, 77 Nobel laureates sent the letter expressing their concerns. Congressman Raskin, as you know, is chairman of the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and served as, remember, the House lead manager of the impeachment trials. And he's a former constitutional law professor. And when he was in the Maryland State Senate, he was the leading advocate and champion of laws to protect civil rights and to fight hate crimes and to uplift women, children, and families, and worked closely with me and our AAPI community. And Congressman Raskin has agreed to have a congressional House proceeding on the profiling of our scientists of Chinese or Asian descent. It will help, of course, shine light on those injustices and produce recommendations to help end this profiling and other discriminatory actions, and offer legislative and policy measures to ensure greater transparency, accountability, including important data requests and collection. So tomorrow, we're having a conversation with the Congressional House Oversight Committee staff on the date, the time, and potential witnesses and other particulars. It's so important that we have the most compelling witnesses, including those who've been subjected to the most egregious actions. The proceeding may be sometime in July, but we'll keep you updated on the particulars and exact details. We are truly grateful for the courage and the conviction of those witnesses who are willing to come forward and to help us on this proceeding, and particularly grateful to Congressman Jamie Raskin, Congressman Ted Lieu, and members of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and other congressional members, and of course our alliance signatories, APA Justice, APA Advancing Justice, and other leaders and of major scientific, AAPI, civil rights, faith, and other organizations for their exemplary and tireless efforts in moving this proceeding forward, and particularly for never giving up. This has been truly a great coalition effort from all our different communities, as this is one of the most important issues facing us now for our AAPI community and for all communities and for America. And I thank you so much for letting me be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee, and thank you for your advocacy in helping to get that hearing put together. So really appreciate it. Good to hear some good news. And now it's as a resident of the 33rd Congressional District in California, where I think we just experienced a small earthquake. It's my distinct honor to recognize Representative Ted Lieu and thank him for his service to the nation, both as an Air Force officer and now as a congressman, and particularly thank him for his leadership in conducting oversight of the FBI and the Justice Department from his perch on the House Judiciary Committee, and his representation of the Asian American community as a representative of the Congressional Asian Pacific Islander Caucus. Representative Lieu, if you're here, we'd love to hear from you now. I know that Representative Lieu had some other Hill business, so he may be caught up in that, and when he returns, we'll be ready for that. And right before we get to the panel discussion, I want to recognize all the hard work done by the individuals who are part of the co-sponsoring organizations that produce this webinar series and defend the Asian American and particularly Chinese American communities in many aspects. First, Jinling Chai of the United Chinese Americans. Jinling.
Yeah, hi. As the UCA and the Tennessee Chinese American Alliance, we're very proud of the Chinese community has done to step up to offer moral and financial support to Professor Hu during this ordeal. It certainly means a lot as we face the powerful federal government, and they have demonstrated tremendous solidarity and the power to resist racial profiling and discrimination. And we still have a lot more to do as we hear more. We have heard more what's being unveiled during this trial. We certainly applaud Congress to launch actions, investigation into the misconduct of the FBI and DOJ. And we also want to really our elected officials to put pressure on the White House to stop this China initiative. And as much as we are outraged at the FBI and DOJ, I have to say, we are maintaining confidence in the American democracy. And for many of us who came from China, we realize it is not possible really for people, individuals, to face the powerful government, right? And in China. And so this is really demonstrate what American democracy is all about. And that certainly we want to preserve the system to protect individual liberties for all the people. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the great work that you and your organizations have done to support Professor Hu there in Tennessee. We really appreciate that. And I understand Representative Lieu is now here, and respecting that he has a very busy schedule, we really appreciate all the work that you've done, Representative Lieu. So you have the floor.
I think he's still tied up.
Okay, the direct message I got was that he was here, but
Yeah, he's here. He's logging already.
okay. All right. Well, just let me know whenever the congressman is available and we'll interrupt. He obviously there's a lot of busy work to be done on Capitol Hill, and we appreciate the time that he can take to speak with us. But let me get back to introducing the organizers. Next up with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, Gisela Kusakawa. Thanks so much for all the work that you've done, helping to put the webinar together, and please give us a few comments about your work.
And thank you so much, Mike, for being a leading expert on this issue. Hello, everyone. I'm an attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and lead our advocacy work on anti-racial profiling. Advancing Justice, AAJC seeks to end the racial profiling of Asian Americans, immigrants, and justice for many impacted persons like Dr. Hu. I know that many of you are seeking more insight on what you can do and how we can help you. Our organization has addressed Dr. Hu's case with a very holistic approach and can provide support to those impacted through amicus briefs, a legal referral service, Hill advocacy, and community engagement. For example, for Dr. Hu, we urged the U.S. attorney to drop the case against him, requested support, and provided a platform to share his story with congressional members, including Representative Ted Lieu and Chairwoman Chu, and led a KPAC briefing to share our concerns with his case. Additionally, my colleague Vivian provided support, coordination, media training, and outreach and materials for Dr. Hu and local organizations. We thank those who worked with us on the ground, particularly Jin Liang, for his great leadership in the community. We also wanted to lift up Knoxville Chinese Christian Church, East Tennessee Chinese American Care, and United Chinese Americans Greater Memphis Chapter. Moreover, we wanted to address the root issues underlying Dr. Hu's case. As such, we are leading meetings with multiple federal agencies, including a former meeting with Senator Warner with NIH and NSF, and spearheaded a meeting with high-level Biden officials with the White House to ask for a moratorium and review of the China Initiative. If you're interested in being involved, feel free to contact me. I would like to pass the floor back to Mike since we have Representative Ted Lieu here. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome, Representative Lieu. It's really great to have you here. I understand how busy you are, so we really appreciate your time. And I know how interested you are in this issue. So please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. And can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you just great.
Very good. So I'm sorry I'm late. We're in the middle of a Judiciary Committee hearing on antitrust issues, but I'm skipping out for a little bit to join with all of you. And I thought I'd give you a brief update about the letter that I wrote with Pramila Jayapal and Mandar Jones, also on the Judiciary Committee, regarding the case of Professor Anming Hu. And as all of you know, the FBI agent in that case purportedly admitted to basically lying about accusing Professor Hu of being a Chinese spy, lying about him dealing with Chinese military operatives, lying about a range of other issues. And so we're asking the Department of Justice Inspector General to investigate. And we hope that we'll get some good results from that. But as part of the investigation, we're also looking at the Inspector General to investigate the China Initiative to see not only was there racial ethnic profiling in this case, to see if that happened, but also if the China Initiative itself puts untoward pressure on FBI agents and prosecutors to engage in racial or ethnic profiling. And we'll hopefully have the Inspector General take that case up. And then if that happens, we'll await the results to see what the IG concludes. At the same time, I, along with other members of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, have had meetings with Biden administration officials, including Susan Rice, where we directly asked her to have the Biden administration review the China Initiative, which was started under the former president, to see if it's something that should in fact be continued and whether there are problems with it. So we'll see what the Biden-Harris administration also does. And right now we're just trying to ask questions, get information. And let me sort of step back at a much 30,000 foot level and explain why this is important. We saw a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans during the pandemic. And I don't believe it was a coincidence that it just happened timing wise. I believe it happened because people started to think that Asian Americans somehow started COVID-19 or carrying the virus and so on. And why do they think that? Partly because a former president would use racist phrases like Kung Flu. On the Judiciary Committee, we had hearings earlier this year where experts testified that they could track an increase in hate crimes and hate incidents with the use of phrases by the former president, such as Kung Flu. And it is this inability to separate Americans who happen to be of Asian descent from the government of China that can cause significant problems to Asian Americans here in the US. We've seen this repeatedly play out. Japanese Americans were interned because our government was unable to separate Americans who happen to be of Japanese descent from the Imperial Army of Japan. In the 1980s, we saw increased hate crimes against Asian Americans because America feared the economic rise of Japan. And again, Americans were confusing Japanese foreign nationals with Asian Americans. And so this is a problem that occurs repeatedly. And so we have to make sure that there's a bright line and people understand there is no linkage between an American who happens to be of Asian descent and the Communist Party of China. So we're going to keep on asking questions and hopefully we'll get some good answers. And with that, happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman Lieu, and appreciate it. As if you could stick around as long as you can stick around for us to get to the Q&A. I'm sure that there will be some questions. And go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you wanted to say something else.
No, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So back to the program. One of the other co-sponsors is Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs and their representative, Vincent Huang.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I would like to thank Congressman Ted Lieu, Senator Susan Lee for coming here today, and also for your championship of our community, for your tireless effort in holding the government accountable. APAPA is in the business of empowering our community, making sure our voice are heard. And also we want to make sure our fellow community members, we have a voice, and also even though they are being treated in a bad way, we want to make sure they go through a fair and a transparent and accountable due process, and give them the voice. And I'm also especially thankful to Phil, the attorney for Professor Hu, for his effort to hold the government accountable, and also for Julian Tsai and the local community members in Tennessee for speaking out, for standing up for Professor Anming Hu. Thank you so much. And also thanks to Maggie Lewis for your tireless effort in raising awareness of China initiative. It's very important we work together. And also thanks Professor Huang for coming here today as well.
Thanks very much, Vincent. I appreciate all your support throughout the webinar project. And last but not least, Jeremy Wu of the APA Justice Task Force.
Thank you, Mike. I recall vividly approaching you first last year, proposing the idea that led to this important webinar series on the China Initiative. And I put China Initiative in quotes. And it also led to this productive and fulfilling partnership with the Brennan Center, AAJC, APAPA, and UCA. I also want to give Professor Maggie Lewis a shout out because she planted the idea in the first place going back last July. We also want to thank all of you and today's speaker, Congressman Lieu, Senator Lee, and all of you in the audience and the associated ecosystem that get us to where we are today. We're not naive about national security, but APA justice will always facilitate and advocate for justice and fairness for Asian Americans and all Americans for that matter. Thank you all.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. And finally, I'd like to thank Stephen Pei, who has done a lot of the organizing behind the scenes and actually does all the technical work, without whom we'd all be shouting into unconnected flat screens. So thank you, Stephen. We really appreciate all you've done and keep doing. So now on to the panel discussion. My first question will go to Phil Lomonaco, again, is Professor Hu's defense attorney and has been a defense attorney for some time. Can you tell us about how you first got into this case and, you know, in your decades of experience, what you think sets it apart from the normal criminal defense case?
Well, thank you, Mike, for asking me to join in on this. The first thought that ran through my mind when you asked me how I got involved in this is that I had the wonderful fortune to marry the best thing that ever happened to me. And Yan Du is my wife, and knowing her and when she came to the United States, we got involved in the Chinese Christian church, and actually I think Anming is a member there too. So that's how I got involved. When he got arrested, we were all sort of a family there with the church. And so, you know, the thing that's really striking about this is that there's so much involved, and I know very little compared to everything that's involved in this. But what I've learned from the case that there is pressure on the agents, mostly the FBI and Department of Justice, the federal prosecutors, to root out espionage. And it comes from the top down. And what the top down doesn't understand is that, you know, there's consequences for things they say. And I think if this organization can accomplish anything, I think that showing the distinction between CCP and the millions and millions of wonderful, beautiful, common people that are loving and kind to their families and friends needs to be shown. And the professors, for the most part, the vast majority of Chinese in the United States are just like everybody else, trying to make a living, trying to do well for their family, their community. And people need to realize that, and I don't think they do. I think they just group them all together, maybe because of what's been said by some of the past administration. And, you know, fear creates problems. You know, when they talk about, you know, China taking over or China stealing our secrets, and our government, the people in power, they get fearful, and they start grouping people together, and they don't think about the words they say. They don't think about the effect of what they're talking about. When the China Initiative started, the Justice Department, you know, sent out the word to the all 93, I think, different jurisdictions with the U.S. attorneys in those jurisdictions, that we are going to be investigating, and we're going to be prosecuting espionage caused by China. And, you know, I don't think anybody can say there isn't espionage. It's not only China, it's the world doing it to each other. And we're a human race, and we're not perfect. But when you center and get and point the gun, you're pointing it at the wrong people. What the agents have done has gotten together and they think, well, okay, you know, the espionage is stealing secrets. Where do we look for those secrets? do they go to the corporations where the secrets are, or do they go to the low-hanging fruit of these professors, Chinese professors, and that's the only ones they concentrated on. And it clearly is biased racial profiling, in my opinion. Although in our case, the government filed a motion asking that we don't talk about selective prosecution. But it's easy to pick on scientists because they're completely open with what they do. In fact, they're encouraged to publish their research. And for decades, the universities have insisted that their professors go out and get grants, bring money into the university, make a name for the university, collaborate and participate with other universities nationally and internationally. And that was all looked upon as being the right thing to do. And it is. I mean, most of the stuff they talk about and most of the research they do is all fundamental research. It's not top secret. It's not classified. It's not stuff that, you know, is going to be something that China doesn't know about, because China's doing it too. But that's what happened in this case. The agents went out and they took the publications off the internet and they tied it into Professor Hu. Their initial premise for investigating Professor Hu was inaccurate. And they even said in their initial investigation papers that it was, I can't remember the exact words, but marginal facts based on relatively, weak, and now I'm paraphrasing, but their sources were not the best. And reminds me of the Steele dossier, I guess. But I think there ought to be some reasonable articulable suspicion before the FBI agents can just do what they did to Professor Hu. I think they should have checks and balances where they go to somebody that is detached and neutral and says, look, this is what we've got. Can we follow this guy around for a year and a half? Can we take pictures of his teenage son? Can we go to the university and get everything that ever happened to him? Can we put a red flag on him when he travels internationally? Can we do that? Do we have enough to do that? And then somebody ought to say yes or no.
And I think you make a good point. You know, if the FBI had an economic espionage initiative, they could have started this case, but they couldn't have claimed that the prosecution of Professor Hu for some minor administrative error on a grant form was part of the economic espionage initiative, where by calling it the China initiative, it doesn't matter that they're no longer investigating economic espionage. It just matters that this is somebody who fits the frame of somebody with a nexus to China, even if that's merely ancestral.
Yes.
Maggie, you wrote about this from a scholarly perspective very early. Almost as soon as it was announced, you started putting pen to paper. How much does this case bear out the warnings that you were trying to put out with your paper, Criminalizing China?
Well, thanks, Mike. And let me just echo all the thanks for the organizers and everyone working on these issues. I am a China studies person by my history. I first went to Beijing in 1995. And this is the most I've ever worked with AAPI communities. And in many ways, it's been a fantastic experience to get to know all these great people. But I wish I didn't know you so well, because the reason is because of the reverberations of foreign policy on domestic audiences. And I wish the researchers and the scientists were in their labs doing the work that's going to make our economy stronger. I wish the retired scientists were able to go and hang out and fish or be with their grandkids or learn to tango, whatever they want to do other than organizing webinars about bias. But that's where we are. And I really think that it's so important to break down that there's several issues going on here. And even before the China initiative, there were cases. And so this didn't start in November of 2018. It predated it, but that was a decision by then the Trump administration under Attorney General Sessions to throw a massive amount of resources behind this idea that there were threats emanating from the PRC party state, and in particular, that we needed to look for non-traditional collectors, that these, not your sort of old school spies, but rather that the researchers, the students, people who had connections to China, whether it be through ethnicity or their nationality, that there were people among us. And no matter how many times the government says most people who are either currently still PRC citizens or have heritage ties are not a threat, if you keep saying China initiative and you keep saying that, you know, we are worried about this Chinese threat and the China threat, it is going to have implications. So here I'd like to just point out with bias, there's really two layers. There's the explicit bias, and we did see that under the Trump administration. One of the more glaring examples was then US Attorney Lelling, who was in charge of Massachusetts, so overseeing the Gang Chen case, the Lieber case. And when Gang Chen, a professor at MIT, was indicted, Lelling flat out said, this isn't about greed, this is about loyalty to China. And to say that about a naturalized US citizen is taking us back to an era that is just smacking of xenophobia. Now under the Biden administration, I'm less concerned about that level of explicit bias, but still huge issues with implicit or unconscious bias. Because if you tell the FBI agents and the prosecutors that this is a big priority, this is a huge priority of Main Justice in DC, and then you call it the China Initiative, which is unprecedented as far as anyone can tell me to name an initiative after a country, that people are going to be drawn, whether they realize it or not, to people who have certain characteristics. And the Justice Manual, which is the guidance for prosecutors, says flat out that prosecutors should not be influenced by a number of factors, including race and national origin. And influenced by is also, I think, including that unconscious influence. And I have not seen any grappling with how this affects decision-making, despite that the American Bar Association and many, many scholars have shown that prosecutors and investigators are definitely influenced by unconscious bias. And I myself, I'm a lawyer, and that was before I was a law professor, and I hold lawyers to a very high standard, and we can do better. And just one more point before I want to make sure we keep this conversational, but the bias reasons alone are more than enough reason to just end the China Initiative, reframe this in a country neutral manner so we're not putting people under the microscope that have connections to China. But I also want to emphasize that the reason the China Initiative was put in was to protect intellectual property and to promote an innovative environment in the United States. And so most recently, right now in the House, because it passed the Senate, you have the US Innovation and Competition Act. It's an over 2,000-page act all about promoting innovation in the US, directly aimed at competing with China. And this idea that we need to put billions of dollars into the semiconductor industry and really advancing high tech. But at the same time, the US is shooting itself in the foot by having a chilling effect, not only on the directly impacted people like Professor Hu has suffered so greatly, but reverberations amongst the science and research community that people currently in the US who are promoting that innovation are considering leaving, some have left, and it's making it harder to attract the talent we need. Because for areas like artificial intelligence, the US benefits from a flow of PRC citizens coming to the US. And to make it so people do not want to come to the US because they're afraid of racism and xenophobia is ultimately undermining our goals. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the Q&A part.
Thank you very much, appreciate that. Dr. Guiyou Huang, you've been involved in leadership at universities of various sizes all across the country, now at Western Illinois as president. There are some questions in this case about whether the university's response was appropriate to the initial inquiries from the FBI. And we've had a divergence where at some universities, they cooperate significantly with the government, where others like MIT and Columbia, the presidents there have defended their faculty and students and researchers from unwarranted scrutiny. What can university leaders, or what do we need to do to educate university leaders, and what can they do to better protect their students and faculty when the FBI comes calling?
Thank you so much, Michael, and great meeting many distinguished speakers here. Congressman Ted Lieu and Senator Susan Lee, and honor to meet you for the first time. I heard about you when I was on the East Coast or in the Midwest. Thank you to Jeremy and Professor Pei. I was here as a university leader, as an academic leader, right? The university, the president have a huge responsibility to protect its students, its faculty and staff, and certainly the faculty who are involved in scientific research or practical research for that matter, because research doesn't benefit one person or one individual group. It would benefit mankind as a whole. The thing I think when this topic came up, I thought a lot about all the historical ramifications of the accusation filed against Professor Hu by the federal government. If we go back to, as many of you are familiar, you go back to the 1940s when the Japanese Americans were interned on the West Coast, right? And despite their citizenship, despite their loyalty to the country, but because of their ethnic association with Japan, therefore many of them became natural suspects, right? We do not want to see that happen again. The China initiative, in my opinion, must be separated from the Chinese in America. That's extremely important, right? Because China is a country, as is America. There are scientists who work across borders, right? Now, then again, scientific research right now is really an international effort or a global effort. A lot of, even you look at the Nobel Prize laureates, right? Many of them win the award collaboratively because they do collaborative work. In that regard, I think it's important for the university to recognize the nature of the collaboration in scientific research, explorations, to recognize how to protect the faculty, the scientists in the research involved. Now, I'm sure in each university I'm familiar with, they all have institutional policies, protecting the research subject, protecting the researchers, right? At the same time, there is also conflict of interest policies, right? How do we use that policy to protect our faculty? Now, it's important to educate the faculty, the scientists, and the researchers of their responsibilities, right? And when the policy, when that education is present, then we can avoid certain encroachment by the state or federal government, especially when there's no evidence involved. The other thing really is I want to talk about the tenure a little bit, because tenure is a very controversial practice in the academic setting. Is tenure a good thing or bad? Or why do only universities have a tenure? Why not the legal profession, the nursing profession, for example? In my opinion, a tenure is important because that is one important way to hopefully guarantee, the freedom of speech, freedom of the scientific exploration, right? So that tenure is a protection. The university needs to use that tool, that mechanism to protect the scientists and the faculty. I think that's extremely important. But related to the China initiative, right? I heard, if I could, Maggie Lewis talk about, these legal issues. Asians, in this case, since 1940s again, we have been considered the minority, a model minority. Some scholars take issue with that because if the government or the mainstream population recognize Asian Americans as a model minority, therefore this group doesn't need to be further recognized, doesn't need any support from anybody else. In a way that made Asian American, marginalized many Asian Americans. Therefore, I'm an immigrant. I came to this country 32 years ago. Looking at racial dynamics from an immigrant viewpoint, not a native born, neither black nor white, nor Latino, or any other groups, right? Now I came with a strong identity. I know who I was. I know who I am. But when you are a member of a minority group, the perceptions you are doing so well, right? You as a result, you get neglected. We become the invisible group, right? We are invisible, right? So that therefore if you're not visible, you are not that important, right? So that lends excuses to victimization of many Asians and Asian scientists in this case. I think that's a real issue. I'm also talking about on the campus level or a state or federal level, how to truly combat racism. I do believe that Asians, myself included, have been subject to many manifestations of racism, whether at a higher level or an institutional level, right? This subtle racism or covert racism, in my opinion, is the hardest racism to combat because you are being neglected, you are being ignored, disregarded. Therefore, you have no respect, not the same level of respect you would, others would get, right? Again, that creates opportunities for marginalization, for ostracization, and for racial profiling. I think that's one important reason, right? So to combat this, I do think that we need voices like Congressman Lieu and Senator Lee, because they are sort of the face of Asian Americans. I know not everybody can be represented, but if there are strong voices, this is my issue sometimes with this country, right? You have 5% of the population that is Asian, and yet their voice is hardly heard. Really, I live in 7 states. 7 states. That's a lot of states. Most of the time, as an academic leader, as a chancellor, president, or a senior vice president, I led faculty. I handle many issues. The way I look at it, we need to be more visible. We need to be more vocal, right? We need the federal level, the state, institutional level to look at the Asians. They are the silent contributors to American civilization, and yet they don't get as much credit, as they deserve, right? The case we are looking at is one of them, right? How do we deal with such covert racism? How do we separate China from the Chinese in this country? I think that's an extremely important topic. How do we separate, and how do we avoid the repetition of Japanese American internment that would happen, to other groups? So I know these questions are intertwined. I'm happy to answer any further questions. I'm going to stop there for now.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Huang. Representative Lieu, you've been a longtime champion of civil rights for all groups that are unfairly targeted, but you're also rare in the Congress in that you have a technology background. And I think one of the problems with the China initiative is that scientific advancements and technological advancements are key to protecting our security. Certainly during a year that we've suffered with the pandemic and the increasing effects of climate change, these are important issues that address our national security. And if the Justice Department program, the China initiative, is actually driving scientists and technologies away from American universities, how do we make the Justice Department understand that this advancement in science and technologies is essential to our national security?
That's a great question. And by the way, I'm a recovering computer science major. But it is true that with the internet and with the 21st century technologies, collaboration does benefit science and technology. And a lot of times you may have a good idea, but maybe someone in another country may be working on the same thing and have an even better idea or have a different idea that affects your idea. And collaboration can be very, very helpful to helping not just science and technology in general, but also US science and US technology. And what we do need to do is have Margaret Justice understand the trade-offs that are happening if you're going to start pushing out very smart people from our universities and colleges, because they fear being federally prosecuted for paperwork errors. That's why I do also support the request from Asian Americans for Advancing Justice saying, hey, why don't we let professors make corrections on their forms? I mean, if the government agency thinks that this professor filed a paperwork error, well, instead of prosecuting the professor, why don't we let them correct the form? And you may have all seen recently that one of the jurors in the Professor Hu case came out publicly and said it was a ridiculous case. So we're going to, again, keep pushing on this issue and keep trying to get the Department of Justice to do the right thing.
Great, thank you. And Maggie, you mentioned the Attorney General's manual and the restrictions in there. Phil mentioned the broad scope of the FBI's authority to open investigations without a criminal predicate. There's also racial profiling guidance that is supposed to limit the Justice Department, federal law enforcement's use of racial profiling, but it has very complex loopholes. But it still does ban generalized stereotyping, which would seem to describe pretty clearly what is involved with the China initiative. Do you think the guidance and the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney's manuals need to be changed? Does there need to be a change in the law? And how should we approach that? Or is this something that's simply a policy issue that we can fix through policy?
So first, on this issue about an amnesty or voluntary disclosure program, I don't like the term amnesty because I think it makes it sound too simple. Like people can just sort of say, okay, I'm fine. You know, everything I've done in the past is bygones, and it's not. If the Justice Department does a voluntary disclosure program, which would allow people to come forward and say, I think I have an issue on not disclosing a past relationship with an entity in China or a foreign bank account or whatever it might be, that's still a complicated and fraught process. But I do think that would be important to, first of all, to show good faith by the Justice Department that they are not looking to prosecute people for administrative infractions, but rather they really are using criminal law only for the most egregious violations. And in particular, Eric Lander, the new science advisor to the president, he himself in an interview with Science just a couple of weeks ago said, it's really hard to figure out what you're supposed to disclose. There's so much work that needs to be done in clarifying and streamlining grant reporting requirements to make it so that you're really getting people with these sort of ill intent. And so I think that that's important, backwards looking, and then forwards looking, making it clearer about what are the rules of the road. So we, again, are not doing this sense of gotcha. With respect to racial profiling and the guidance, as people have said, for the FBI to open an investigation, you know this better than I do, Mike, it doesn't require anything. So when we hear Christopher Wray saying a China-related case is opened every 10 hours, or we have thousands of cases in the pipeline, what that tells me is that the FBI is putting a lot of resources behind the China initiative. It does not tell me anything about the prevalence of illegal activity or how that might have shifted over time. So I don't want people to take that as there's been a ballooning in illegal activity. We just don't know that from that number. And here too, I'd also like to emphasize that there's some really great people working in the Justice Department. And one reason I spend so much time on this is I know we can do better, because I don't think that there's been a grappling with, again, that it is about how decision-making is done. So should the rules change, the Justice Manual, and even the law to make, perhaps, as people have mentioned, some sort of better review process before opening an investigation? I think there's work to be done there. But a lot of this is about changing attitudes and about not just changing how people do their jobs, but also who are the people doing those jobs. Because if you look at the leadership of the China initiative, it's both, all I can see is it's white guys. And I'm less worried about the guys in this instance. I'm always appreciative when it's not a manel and I'm on it for representation. But I think we also have issues with representation in the Justice Department. And that really matters about not just for optics, but for actually how people do their jobs and being more aware and sensitive to a lot of the issues that have been raised today.
Great, thanks very much. That's very helpful. And the FBI as well remains a predominantly white male organization. So that lack of diversity, I think, leads to some of that implicit bias and unconscious bias that you were talking about, just because there's a lack of familiarity. Phil, can you update us on the status of the case now? I mean, one of the things that I think is very important, and Jinling mentioned this, is how much public support there was from the community, and how essential was that to your work and to the case, and how can we replicate that kind of support for the next professor who's unfairly charged?
Well, I think that if the next professor that's unfairly charged is Chinese, there's going to be support. And it was wonderful. Professor Hu was put in jail for a couple of weeks, and the jail is not the best reputation around it for jails. Talking to him through a glass window with holes in it, or talking on a telephone when he's on the other side, when we had thousands and thousands and thousands of documents to review and look at and discuss, and would have been impossible. We couldn't have done it. At least the magistrate let him out on a ankle bracelet, and he stayed in his home. He couldn't go anywhere, but his home became what we called the war room. And we had a computer and a ping pong table full of papers. So that was good. You know, the status of the case right now, the way it stands, is the government has to decide whether they want to announce a dismissal of the case or whether they're going to retry it again. I know the whole transcript has been ordered by somebody. I would expect that the government is reviewing the transcript. The decision to re-prosecute probably isn't going to be made locally here, and it's going to be up in Washington. And the judge still has a card he can play if they do decide to retry Professor Hu. We filed a couple of motions to dismiss. First, before the trial even started, we filed a motion for dismissal because of vagueness, that the NASA restriction was so vague, Professor Hu didn't understand it. He didn't know he was going to be considered China by the FBI, and the FBI, it's our opinion, convinced the administrators at UT that, had they known that he had a part-time summer job in Beijing University, they wouldn't have given him the NASA grant. It's really funny that the form that they accused him of misrepresenting, they never checked when they gave him the NASA grant. They never used the form to see. And we proved pretty well at trial that he didn't violate that agreement. It was only a part-time job, didn't rise to the level of conflict of interest. So the judge still can dismiss this case. The vagueness issue, also, we believe the case law shows that if Professor Hu did not intend to commit any harm, even if he did try to trick NASA, which clearly I don't believe he did. Clearly he's innocent on this. But even if the jury believed he did, the judge can dismiss the fraud charges because the case law says if you don't intend to commit harm, it's not fraud. So he could come back and still, if the government says, well, we want to try it again, he can maybe dismiss the case or some of the counts. Hopefully he won't have to do that. But normally the judge makes a ruling on that motion right when you make it, halfway through trial. But he reserved it. He reserved it at the end of the trial. And I think he's waiting to see, first of all, he's waiting to see if the jury came back not guilty, then he wouldn't have to do anything. Now he's waiting to see if the government is going to announce a retrial.
Thanks. That's very helpful. And Senator Lee, if you don't mind taking a question, a lot of the questions that we're getting in the chat, people want to know how they can help and how they can work. And I know that your work there in the state legislature, you have some advice for them about how they can get their local representatives aware and involved in this kind of work. And also, and I don't know if Congressman Lieu had to go, but how we work with our legislators and our elected representatives to get to positive change.
Well, I think it's important to keep this issue in the limelight. and for all our, not just the AAPI community, but to have partnerships with our other communities like Latina, Black, and Faith, and all the different groups to still stay active on this issue and to keep it alive, because we need to make sure that we have that congressional oversight. And I think we're moving towards that right now. And I'd like to commend Congressman Lieu for his exemplary work and leadership in fighting for justice, particularly for him calling on the Department of Justice Inspector General to look into the Professor Hu's case. That is really important. I think we also need to keep attention on the other things that are happening to bring to light the injustices that are happening, like the investigation into what the Commerce Department was doing too. That was so appalling. I could not believe it. And it was going on for years, and it was unchecked, and it was arbitrary, and it was impacting mostly Asian Americans. And we need to also ensure that all of us in our community are informed about what's going on, and to keep our elected officials, both state and also, but particularly our congressional members, to let them know how important this is to our community, but also to science and to America, to ensure that we are able to be that leader in science, but also to protect the civil rights of our scientists who are really making those advancements in breakthrough treatments to save lives, especially during this pandemic. So I think we can't go back, we gotta go forward. And I think I'm so heartened by all the different communities that joined our AAPI community, our congressional members like Congressman Lieu and Congressman Raskin for raising this to a national level. So and for the coalition effort that went into to where we are right now. And I thank everyone who's on this panel, everyone who's tuning in today in this webinar for all that you've done to help us pursue justice, and just keep informed and keep this in the limelight, and keep in touch with your elected officials. And thank you for what you've done.
Thank you. And just for the audience members that don't know, that there was a scandal where the Commerce Department had an internal group that did internal investigations, and they were profiling Chinese and Asian American employees in that program. Representative Lieu, if you could follow up, you know, most people have never called their congressman's office. They don't know how to engage like that. How can members of the audience be helpful to you in pursuing an agenda that demands more accountability from the FBI and on this issue?
Thank you, Michael, for that question. First of all, thank you and the Brennan Center for all your advocacy. So we really appreciate that. I think Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So understand your power to shape public sentiment. Social media is free. If you write a post that's interesting, maybe it will affect some folks in other states. Think about writing letters to the editor. It's true that many people do write letters to the editor. It's also true many of them come from the same people. So when you start writing in, then eventually you'll get published and you can start changing hearts and minds. And in terms of these specific issues, think about helping out organizations like the Brennan Center or Asian Americans for Advancing Justice or other civil rights organizations working on these issues. You can also lobby your member of Congress or your U.S. Senator, as well as the president and vice president. And so all of that, along with other people who are working in concert, all of that is helpful. And so we just have to, again, keep pushing and keep the pressure up and ask the right questions. And then we'll go from there once we get the actual evidence.
Great, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Appreciate all the time that you've been able to give us. Guiyou, are university presidents amenable to that kind of public pressure? I know a lot of universities are actually public institutions, and the taxpayer has an interest in making sure that they're protecting the rights of their students and faculty. Is there a way that the public can interact with university leaders to raise these issues?
Oh yeah, no, in my area, there are some pretty active, community leaders, regarding different issues. Could it be about foreign relations? Could it be about individual university relationship with a scientist or with a faculty? And again, I think the universities are ready to listen. I'm ready to work with all groups, to protect our faculty and students, because we do a lot of research. We do get, for example, earmarks from the House of Representatives, right? So, there are a lot of things that can be done. I do think that the Chinese scientists in this country, they are in a special situation, and they need to be looked after by university leadership like myself.
And obviously, where there's actually a case in these many universities, we've seen a differential where at some universities the faculty and the staff rally around the person, where at others so much of it is happening behind closed doors. And I think that's a big part of the problem, is that of course we want to protect the privacy of people being subjected to some kind of internal disciplinary action. But it makes it hard then to rally public support when these things are happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It really depends on a number of external factors, right? This is, I would say academic politics is one of the most interesting politics you can ever encounter, right? Depends on who's looking at these issues and whose interest is being protected or victimized. I can't further generalize about it, but I agree with you that university, I mentioned just now, I mentioned tenure, right, as a way to protect the faculty member, whether it's the federal government, a federal authority coming in to look at the research profile of a faculty member, the university should be on the first line to defend them. Right. So, fortunately, I haven't seen any cases like that at my own universities where I have been a president, but I know there are gray areas that could cause problems. That's when I think clarity is needed, especially clarity on policies and laws, right? This is a national issue, not institutional alone.
Right. And I think, and Maggie, you've talked about this a lot, that it's really important to recognize that there is a genuine threat, that economic espionage from many countries, including the Chinese government, is a problem. But I think what this case shows is that once a program like the China Initiative is created, it diverts agents from that important work. In other words, this case didn't do anything to actually improve our security against economic espionage.
Yeah, I just see with that exactly. We need to figure out what are really the assets and what are the things that we want to protect, because our open science model in the United States does create vulnerabilities, and there needs to be a conversation that involves the right people, the people who understand the science and the law together to make clear guidelines. And then when we do decide these are assets we want to protect those assets from threats, no matter where they emanate from. And to be clear, there are a lot of reasons to be worried about what's going on in Beijing. And Xi Jinping has emphasized indigenous innovation, and some of it is just recruiting and using above board methods, but there are also real reasons to be concerned about incentivizing breaking the law. I'm in Taiwan. If there's any place that understands the threat emanating from Beijing, it's where I am right now. So I don't want us to come across as naive. And just finally, too, when the points about what can people do, Two additional things. I think that there's AAJC and other organizations are doing bystander training. And I think that's so important, especially as people emerge out coming from the pandemic, that we are still seeing a lot of anti-AAPI violence. And bystander training does not mean that you need to be Spider-Man or Shazam. Got a 6 and 8-year-old, lots of superheroes. There's other ways to be helpful without actually putting yourself in harm's way. So I'd recommend those trainings. And also, when you look back, I think the United States with the model minority, but also the perpetual outsider, that universities and people have not done a great job of welcoming people coming from China and other places who come over as students, having them over for Thanksgiving, going to lunch, like making them really feel welcome in the United States is something that's made us so strong historically. And we need to do more to do that. So it's really getting the best and the brightest people who want to come to the US and stay in the US and weaving them into that fabric so they really feel part of the United States.
Great, thank you. And Phil, we're running out of time, but because of course this webinar focused on Professor Hu's case, are there any last words that you want to say on behalf of Professor Hu and his family?
They are overwhelmed with the help and the generosity and the love that they've received from people like we've had here tonight and other support. Professor Hu is a strong individual. He, right from the start, he wanted to fight, and that's good. And his wife has been very supportive too. And they thank everybody for helping, and I do too. I think that if we could all, I do want to say one thing though. I think, we prayed every day on the way to the courtroom. And I think our answers were heard or were given to us. And I think there was miracles that happened in the courtroom, amazing things. So I just want to give all the glory to God above. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today. But I'd like to thank the panelists, Phil Lomonaco, Maggie Lewis, Guiyou, Huang, for an excellent discussion, and of course to Congressman Ted Lieu and to Susan Lee for all the work that they're doing and for the keynote addresses that they provided. And a special thanks to Professor Hu and his wife Ivy for being with us today. I'd also like to thank the Brennan Center's co-sponsoring organizations, once again, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, and Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience for your interest in these issues. For more information about previous webinars in this series, please look for them at the APA Justice website. And you can sign up for email alerts with the sponsoring organizations, and please support their work as Congressman Lieu graciously advised. So I appreciate everybody being involved in this webinar series for now over a year since we started. But I think that we've made great strides in raising awareness about the problems with the China Initiative. And we're hopeful that we'll get some policy reform. Thanks very much.